The facts in Iraq's behavior demonstrate that Saddam Hussein and his regime have made no effort to disarm as required by the international community. Indeed, the facts and Iraq's behavior show that Saddam Hussein and his regime are concealing their efforts to produce more weapons of mass destruction. None of this should come as a surprise to any of us. Terrorism has been a tool used by Saddam for decades. Saddam was a supporter of terrorism long before these terrorist networks had a name. And this support continues. The nexus of poisons and terror is new. The nexus of Iraq and terror is old. The combination is lethal. With this track record, Iraqi denials of supporting terrorism take their place alongside the other Iraqi denials of weapons of mass destruction. It is all a web of lies.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign. More than 35 countries are giving crucial support, from the use of naval and air bases, to help with intelligence and logistics, to the deployment of combat units. Every nation in this coalition has chosen to bear the duty and share the honor of serving in our common defense. To all the men and women of the United States Armed Forces now in the Middle East, the peace of a troubled world and the hopes of an oppressed people now depend on you.
On Tuesday night, I gave the order for British forces to take part in military action in Iraq. Tonight, British servicemen and women are engaged from air, land and sea. Their mission? To remove Saddam Hussein from power and disarm Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction. I know this course of action has produced deep divisions of opinion in our country. But I know also the British people will now be united in sending our armed forces our thoughts and prayers. They are the finest in the world, and their families and all of Britain can have great pride in them.
Lisa, what is happening?
Well, we're about 60 miles or so from Baghdad. We are on the main supply route north. Really, when you see it, a huge war effort in support of the push for Baghdad. We've seen column after column after column of vehicles. Now, they've been passing through this area on their way on various routes up to Baghdad over the course of recent days. Remember, of course, that supply chain goes way back down, hundreds of miles down to the Kuwaiti border, ultimately back to bases such as Camp Commando in Kuwait. This, of course, is bringing supplies up to the forward positions. Remember that no army is ever going to go to war without ammunition and without food. So we're seeing stockpiles of the ration packs, MREs as the Americans would call them, stockpiles of water, stockpiles of ammunition, all being loaded up and moving constantly up towards the frontline positions.
Let's bring in our two defence analysts at this point. Lisa, for the moment, stand by with your pictures of that explosion. We'll come back to you. Francis, can we pinpoint where these pictures are from?
We certainly were told the lead task force of 3rd Mechanised Infantry Division coming up from the south was on something called Route or Highway 8, coming directly from the south, from Hilla. It's to the east of the airport, where we know other elements of 3rd Mech Division are based. Colin Brazier is there at the moment. I'd just like to say to Mike Vickery, what would you describe an operation like this, of motoring at, what are they doing, 25 kilometres an hour, occasionally brassing up targets at the side of the road? In British military terms, what would you call this?
Well, it's very difficult to know. I mean, I guess it is. It really is reconnaissance by going and having a look and seeing what's going on. So rather than sending in a small force, as perhaps they did in Mogadishu, and getting that brassed off, they go up with a very large force. If it gets into trouble, it's big enough to fight its way out. And that's really what they're doing. So this is a very large foot, if you like, in the water, and I think they're sending in something that is big enough to see what's going on and to get out if it really comes into real big trouble.
And potentially to hold its position if needed?
Well, indeed, and it is, if you like, a rather smaller idea of what 3 Make Infantry Division did right in the very beginning. Go on as far and as fast as they possibly can. And that's what they appear to be doing here.
Colonel, in layman's terms, what that looks like to me is a city that's been defeated, an army that's been defeated.
It is being defeated, certainly at the moment, but as I say, you know, city centre, I don't know how far they are from the city centre, 2-3 miles, and you know, always before them there's this thought that perhaps there is the Republican Guard, and perhaps they are pulling in towards the city. By no means could they surround the whole city with Republican Guard, or even, you know, give them the sort of frontage that they need to fight across the whole of the city. So do we see that they are trading ground really for time, and is there more of them in the city?
But if you were driving or in charge of that tank at the moment, you'd be pretty happy with the lack
I'd be
of
absolutely
resistance you're
delighted.
facing.
Indeed, and you can see that they're moving at a hell of a lick.
Should point out we did see earlier one M1 A1 that seemed to have received a hit in the engine or something, which was being towed.
Yeah. It looked very much to me as if it was a much overheating engine that's brewed up.
But there was a slight fire which we saw earlier. Certainly there was a picture of one Iraqi reconnaissance armoured car, BRDM-2, had been hit.
Okay, we're en route. Hey, they got a firefight, World Food. Let's just go check it out. We're gonna go there first. We'll bypass everything else. Okay, we're about 5 mics out. Let's go.
He never travels alone for good reason. 5 US soldiers have been killed in the past 2 days. Another dozen wounded.
I don't really explain a lot to my daughter. She's 7. But all she understands is that I'm coming out here. I'm in big trucks. I drop off loads for people so they can eat and drink, and then I go back. And, you know, that's as much as she needs to know.
Before Saturday night's capture. Today, Colonel Hickey took Scott Pelley to the site of Saddam's last stand and told us about the army he sent to catch a man.
About 600 soldiers, lots of tanks, Bradleys, aircraft, Humvees, howitzers in position ready to provide fire support.
Just to capture Saddam Hussein?
Well, our estimate was there was going to be armed resistance.
You were expecting a gunfight?
Absolutely.
It won't open.
The capture of Saddam was nothing like Colonel James Hickey expected. The 8-month manhunt ended here.
This is it.
In a muddy orange grove where the dictator had fallen from palaces to pauper.
This is about what it looked like when we got here.
Hickey showed us the one-room shack and outdoor kitchen where Saddam was reduced to squalor. He still fancied himself president of a nation, but here he was the lord of the flies.
It's happy tuna.
Saddam's kitchen.
Well, for some time, I guess.
It's got his instant coffee, cans of tuna, and jars of beans.
Just yesterday, Secretary of State Colin Powell made a surprising admission. He told the Washington Post that he doesn't know whether he would have recommended the invasion of Iraq if he'd been told at the time that there were no stockpiles of banned weapons. Powell said when he made the case for war before the United Nations 1 year ago, he used evidence that reflected the best judgments of the intelligence agencies. But according to the people you're about to meet, long before the war, there was plenty of doubt among intelligence analysts about Saddam's weapons. One analyst, Greg Thielman, told us last fall that key evidence cited by the administration was misrepresented to the public. Thielman should know he'd been in charge of analyzing the Iraqi weapons threat for Powell's own intelligence bureau.
When you saw Secretary of State Powell make his presentation to the United Nations, what did you think?
I had a couple of initial reactions, then I had a more mature reaction. I think my conclusion now is that it's probably one of the low points in his long and distinguished service to the nation.
At the end of the speech, the United Nations and the American people had been misinformed, in your opinion.
I think so.
Greg Thielman was a Foreign Service officer for 25 years. His last job at the State Department was acting director of the Office of Strategic Proliferation and Military Affairs, responsible for analyzing the Iraqi weapons threat.
You and your staff had the highest security clearances.
That's right.
And you saw virtually everything.
That's right.
Whether it came into the CIA or the Defense Department, it all came through your office sooner or later.
Yes.
Thielman was admired at State. One high-ranking official called him honorable, knowledgeable, very experienced. Thielman took a long-planned retirement 4 months before Powell's big moment at the UN. February 5th, 2003 was the day that the world had been waiting for. Secretary Powell presented the evidence against Saddam.
The gravity of this moment is matched by the gravity of the threat that Iraq's weapons of mass destruction pose to the world.
Do you believe that Iraq posed an imminent threat to the United States of America at the point we went to war?
No. I think it didn't even constitute an imminent threat to its neighbors at the time we went to war.
As news of Saddam Hussein's execution spreads across the globe, reactions within Iraq are mixed. Many Iraqis watched the execution on television. Afterwards, some celebrated in the streets. In the Baghdad slum of Sadr City, some paraded an effigy of Saddam hanging from the front of a truck. But much of how Iraqis feel about the execution depends on their tribal loyalties and whether they're Shia or Sunni. In the ethically mixed city of Kirkuk, a member of the Turkoman community congratulated those who carried out the execution, saying Saddam hurt the full spectrum of society. He went on to say that he hopes the end of Saddam will be the beginning of a new era of peace and stability in Iraq. This Kurdish man says the Saddam execution is just like a feast for all Iraqi people. We pray to Almighty God that terrorism be ended, and we hope that stability and security will prevail. In the village near Tikrit where Saddam was born, Sunnis choose to remember Saddam as a hero. This man says Saddam's execution is an honor to all Iraqis. He says Saddam was a historical hero and will be remembered as a man who confronted the occupation and the Americans. In Karbala, this Shiite man says, "We congratulate our oppressed people with the execution of the tyrant Saddam Hussein. He got what he deserved."
The agreement lays out a framework for the withdrawal of American forces in Iraq, a withdrawal that is possible because of the success of the surge.
جنوده وجنود الولايات المتحدة والمدنيين فإننا نقترب كثيرا من هذه النهاية.
شكرا جزيلا.
Senator Obama said the surge could not work, said it would increase sectarian violence, said it was doomed to failure. Recently on a television program, he said it exceeded our wildest expectations. But yet, after conceding that, he still says that he would oppose the surge if he had to decide that again today. Incredibly, Senator Obama didn't go to Iraq for 900 days and never asked for a meeting with General Petraeus.
Well, let's go at some
Senator
of these things.
Obama is the chairperson of a committee that oversights NATO that's in Afghanistan. To this day, he's never had a hearing.
What about that
point? I mean, it's remarkable.
All right.
Which point? You raised a whole bunch of them.
Well, no. All right, let's go to the latter point and we'll back up. The point about your not having been...
Look, I'm very proud of my vice presidential selection, Joe Biden, who's the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and as he explains, and as John well knows, the issues of Afghanistan, the issues of Iraq, critical issues like that, don't go through my subcommittee because they're done as a committee as a whole. But that's Senate inside baseball. Let's get back to the core issue here. Senator McCain is absolutely right that the violence has been reduced as a consequence of the extraordinary sacrifice of our troops and our military families. They have done a brilliant job, and General Petraeus has done a brilliant job. But understand, that was a tactic designed to contain the damage of the previous 4 years of mismanagement of this war. And so John, you like to pretend like the war started in 2007. You talk about the surge, the war started in 2003. And at the time when the war started, you said it was going to be quick and easy. You said we knew where the weapons of mass destruction were. You were wrong. You said that we were going to be greeted as liberators. You were wrong. You said that there was no history of violence between Shia and Sunni, and you were wrong.
The Stars and Stripes were folded today, signaling the end of one of the longest wars in our history. Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta accepted the colors in Baghdad as he formally closed America's nearly 9-year involvement in Iraq. Jim Axelrod was there to witness the end.
The ceremony marked the official end of mission. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta took stock of the treasure spent, more than $800 billion, and the blood spilled during the last 9 years.
Today in particular, we remember the nearly 4,500 brave Americans who made the ultimate sacrifice for their country.
Now the war is in the hands of the historians, who will weigh the toppling of a brutal dictator against a war fought over weapons of mass destruction that were never found.
I can't put it into words, sir. We've been gone such a long time, and I'm just happy to be back home. Yeah.
I'm very excited that they're all back, safe and sound, and with everyone safe. Nothing, no casualties or anything with their unit, and just thank God that they're all back safely.
This is one of the best blessing in my life. Very proud to be the mother of a soldier, and I'm very proud. I'm very blessed. And I remember his dad always, though he's gone. I bet he will be very proud of his son.
But I'm, Jackie, in no doubt at all about your responsibility in this. And 2 million of us on the streets of London told you so at the time. And for you now to try and wash your hands of your share of the responsibility, I'm afraid that's a spot that will not out. All the perfumes of Arabia will not expunge that spot.
And all of your poetry, George, doesn't prevent people from being murdered and massacred in Iraq and Syria at the moment. I'm not washing my hands of what happened in the past.
You killed a million people in Iraq.
That is a separate...
You killed 1 million people in Iraq. It's incredible that you have the brass neck to be sitting here now urging another Iraq war.
George,
after
if
what
I was
you've
still
already
in
done.
Parliament, I would be there tomorrow, living up to my responsibility to answer the call of the Iraqi government and people to help to support them. And the fact that you aren't is something that you will have to live with.
Let me ask a final question to you, George. If not bombing, if not intervention, how do we deal with this cancer?
Give Iraq the weapons that it's already paid for but haven't been delivered. Strengthen the Peshmerga. Strengthen the governments of Iraq and Syria, and ask Saudi Arabia, Turkey and Iran to fight this battle. It's their battle, not ours.
When you said that George W. Bush, which was our last Republican president, a man I respect greatly, a person that we really fought for when he was up against a lot of pressure, that he lied to get us in the war in Iraq. That stung me very deeply. Okay. I don't believe that. I'm just wondering, given some time passing, perhaps you've rethought that? Would you be willing to rethink that?
Well, a lot of people agree with what I said, and I'm not talking about lying. I'm not talking about not lying. Nobody really knows why we went into Iraq. The Iraqis did not knock down. It was not Saddam Hussein that knocked down the World Trade Center. Okay,
that's just what you said was they lied. They said there were weapons of mass destruction, and there were none, and they knew there were none. There were no weapons of mass destruction.
Well, there are a lot of people that think that. There were a lot of people that think, look, bottom line, there were no weapons of mass destruction. They said there are weapons of mass destruction. I was against the war when it started.
Do you think the president of the United States, George W. Bush, lied
Well, look,
to the
I'm not going to
American
get you a
people?
vote, but that's okay. Let me
I'm just giving you another shot
Let me
at
tell you
it.
something. I'll tell you very simply. It may have been the worst decision going into Iraq, may have been the worst decision anybody has made, any president has made in the history of this country. That's how bad it is, okay? Here's what happens. We have spent $2 trillion in Iraq and fighting Iraq. $2 trillion. $2 trillion. Thousands of lives, right? We have wounded warriors who I love all over the place. These are the most incredible. These are braver than all of us in this room put together. I look at the attitude, and I work with them, and these are great people. We got nothing. We have nothing. We're not even there. We can't even make a phone call right now.
But to his question,
I'm trying to separate.
Let me tell you. Do I know?
Do you believe he lied, or do you think
I can tell you this. I don't. Whether he lied or not, he went into Iraq. It was a horrible decision.
For all of this, I express more sorrow, regret, and apology than you may ever know or can believe. Only two things I cannot say. It's claimed by some that by removing Saddam we caused the terrorism today in the Middle East, and that it would have been better to have left him in power. I profoundly disagree. Saddam was himself a wellspring of terror, a continuing threat to peace and to his own people. If he'd been left in power in 2003, then I believe he would once again have threatened world peace, and when the Arab revolutions of 2011 began, he would have clung to power with the same deadly consequences that we see in the carnage in Syria today. Whereas at least in Iraq, for all its challenges, we have today a government that is elected, is recognized as internationally legitimate, and is fighting terrorism with the support of the international community. The world was and is, in my judgment, a better place without Saddam Hussein. Secondly, I will never agree that those who died or were injured made their sacrifice in vain. They fought in the defining global security struggle of the 21st century against the terrorism and violence, which the world over destroys lives, divides communities, and their sacrifice should always be remembered with thanksgiving and with honor when that struggle is eventually won, as it will be. I know some of the families cannot and do not accept this is so. I know there are those who can never forget or forgive me for having taken this decision, and who think that I took it dishonestly. As the report makes clear, there were no lies. Parliament and Cabinet were not misled. There was no secret commitment to war. Intelligence was not falsified, and the decision was made in good faith. However, I accept that the report makes serious criticisms of the way decisions were taken. And again, I accept full responsibility for these points of criticism, even where I do not fully agree with them. I do not think it is fair or accurate to criticize the armed forces, the intelligence services, or the civil service. It was my decision they were acting upon. The armed forces in particular did an extraordinary job throughout our engagement in Iraq in the incredibly difficult mission we gave them. I pay tribute to them. Any faults derive from my decisions and should not attach to them. They are people of enormous dedication and courage, and the country should be very proud of them.
And personally for myself, anger, that healing, that 11 and a half years I've worked for. I've gone back to that time when I learned that my brother had been killed. And there is one terrorist in this world that the world needs to be aware of, and his name is Tony Blair, the world's worst terrorist.
over the last 2 or 3 weeks, he obviously had a previous view of it. Over the last 2 or 3 weeks, he's been sort of covering his back.
You think he knew he was misleading at the time, in your view?
Yeah, he made a decision, and he made it from what, again, as everybody else has said, I've got this morning. I'll have to sit down and read it properly. But from what I read, yeah, he knew exactly what he was doing.
Can I just read out to you Tony Blair's reaction that he has recently given out in a statement? I will take full responsibility for any mistakes without exception or excuse. I will at the same time say why, nonetheless, I believe it was better to remove Saddam Hussein. Above all, I pay tribute to armed forces. I will express my profound regret at the loss of life and the grief it's caused families. I will set out the lessons I believe future leaders can learn from my experience.
Well, that was nice that you didn't speak from the heart. That's just a PR patter, lawyer approved.
And there's his apologies
that he's offering.
Can I just make a comment on
Where's
that?
his apology?
One thing I find very interesting that you're all reading from your phones, but why is he not here looking at us? If he's so sure of his decision, why is he not here looking at our eyes and actually seeing our faces?
And years ago we did ask to meet him and he walked away, so this is his opportunity to
Even
come
when
in
he
and
gave
speak to the families now.
When he gave his evidence, it was definitely the Tony Blair show. He thinks he's the puppet master pulling the strings. Well, you know, Tony.
But you know, we've proved him wrong because everything Bill said for the start has actually come out today. And I think he thought they're going to give up and walk away.
What would you say to him if he was here?
Exactly what I've been saying to the world. Look me in the eye.
Yep.
Look me in the eye.
Why did you kill my son, send my son to be killed?
Matthew.
Because I'd hold him responsible for the murder of my son.
You would say, look me in the eye and tell me that you did not mislead the nation in invading Iraq.
Why doesn't he promise on his family?
So in response to the gentleman there, I think what we have to bear in mind is that the intelligence reports were coming back, which were sporadic, patchy, untried, untested, not to be relied upon. And by the time Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell had finished with it, it was detailed, authoritative, up and running now, available to be deployed within 45 minutes. I firmly believe Tony Blair knew that was a lie, and that was what was perpetrated upon the British public.
Absolutely.
And he knew that he was manufacturing and massaging the intelligence reports.
He moulded it to how he wanted to present it to the world.
He changed it from ifs, buts and maybes to definites, up and running now.
Good morning.
How are you, buddy?
Good, how are you?
Good to see you.
You too.
You look good. I heard that. How is the leg?
They are two men with two very different paths.
Welcome aboard. Hey, thanks, man.
United by fate and the misfortunes of war. Munjid Almadaris, the refugee surgeon who fled his homeland to escape Saddam Hussein. And Luis Montalvan, the US war hero who helped end the ruler's tyrannical reign.
We're two sides of a coin, the soldier and the surgeon. Both protecting lives, but the soldier taking lives to protect lives, and the surgeon repairing lives to save lives.
Both men lost their lives, such as they were, to the bloody battlefields of Iraq. But it's how they found a way to start again that's forged their incredible bond.
I have a lot of admiration and respect for people like Lewis, who had a massive trauma in his life that changed him permanently, okay? And he's still become an inspiration to others.
Today, Munjid's a world-renowned surgeon who calls Sydney home. But back in 1999, he was an eager young medical student, starting out his career at Baghdad's chief hospital when he was faced with an unthinkable ultimatum. Cut the ears off soldiers who deserted Hussein's army or be killed himself.
There was no question in my mind that I would be forced to do these kind of atrocities. But then I came up with a different idea that I could run away, and I managed to hide in the female toilets, spent 5 hours there, and from there onward, my life turned upside down, and I became a refugee.
Had you been discovered, what do you think would have happened to you?
Oh, it's very simple. I would be executed.
Mr. Bush, when are you going to apologize for the million Iraqis that are dead because you lied? You lied about weapons. weapons of mass destruction. You lied about connections to 9/11. You lied about Iraq being a threat. You sent me to Iraq. You sent me to Iraq in 2003. My friends are dead. Joshua Castile. You killed people. You lied. You lied about WMDs. 1 million Iraqis are dead because you lied. My friends are dead because you lied. You need to apologize. Apologize!
At this moment, 20 years ago, thousands of American troops were racing across the deserts of southern Iraq toward Baghdad to depose Saddam Hussein and dismantle his alleged weapons of mass destruction programs. The quick victory over Saddam led to a near decade of civil war and occupation, no discovery of WMD, and the deaths of more than 4,400 American troops, and by some estimates, 300,000 Iraqis. Now we look back at the decision to invade, the bloody American occupation, and where Iraq stands today with Paul Wolfowitz. He was Deputy Secretary of Defense during the George W. Bush administration. During the 1980s and 90s, he held a number of senior jobs at the Defense and State Department. Vali Nasser was an advisor at the State Department during the Obama administration. He's now a professor of international relations at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And Charles Dulfer, who helped run UN weapons inspections during the 90s in Iraq. After the U.S. 2003 invasion of Iraq, he led the CIA's Iraq Survey Group, which also looked for Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. Welcome to all three of you gentlemen, and thank you for joining us today. Ambassador Wolfowitz, I'd like to begin with you because you were an advocate for the invasion and for toppling Saddam Hussein. Knowing what we know today, what we've known and watched and learned over these last 20 years, is the U.S. better off today as a result of that war? Are Iraqis better off?
I think the right question to ask is, are we better off today than if Saddam Hussein or his sons were still in power in Iraq? And for me, the answer to that is definitely yes. I believe it was the right thing to do. And I think we're much better off as Americans today because Saddam Hussein is not running the second most important country in the Persian Gulf.
Tell us why you think that is. What do you think the threat would be today?
Look, let's start with a fact which is indisputable. There has not been a repetition of the 9/11 attacks or anything like it in the 20 years since. That was President Bush's main concern, as it had to be, I believe. President Clinton had been warning about the danger of Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction back in the 90s, and his Secretary of Defense actually went on television with a small bag of sugar saying if this were anthrax, it could be spread out in the air and thousands of Americans would die. He was right about that. And I honestly believe that there's been a misunderstanding, partly caused by our inadequate intelligence, the belief that there were stockpiles of various things in Iraq. The important question, and I believe Charles Delfer's Iraq Survey Group established the fact that Saddam was ready to restart all three of his programs. The one that I always considered most dangerous was not the nuclear one, which would be much harder to conceal and much further down the road and much harder to hand over to any terrorist group. It was frankly the biological weapons program, which Charles can contradict me if I'm wrong, but I believe the ISG said that this could be reconstituted in a matter of weeks or a few months. And it's worth bearing in mind that when we finally found when UNSCOM finally found his program in Iraq, it was 5 years after they'd started inspections. And they only found it then because Saddam Hussein's son-in-law defected and told us about it. In other words, the time between the development of a biological threat and its actual discovery is going to be much too long. And we've seen in this pandemic what a biological threat can do to the whole world and to the United States. So having that in the hands of one of history's worst megalomaniac dictators would not be a good thing for America.
Vali Nasser, what do you make of this idea that Saddam could have reconstituted those weapons, could have posed a greater threat? Do you believe the U.S. and Iraqis, the world, is better off without him in power today?
Counterfactual history is difficult to conduct here. Things might have been very different. Saddam might have died a year later. Maybe not, and maybe he would have been a greater danger. But it's difficult to see that the United States and the Middle East are better off. Firstly, we removed the brutal, dangerous dictator, but we replaced him with chaos. And Iraqis went through hell and back in the aftermath of what transpired. And I don't believe that they feel that they're better off. I was recently in Iraq, and most of the young people, even the Shia young people, have a nostalgia for the Saddam era. Secondly, by dismantling the Iraqi military, shattering the Iraqi state, we opened the Arab world for a level of Iranian infiltration into the Arab world that was not possible before the removal of Saddam from power. It has been at a scale that we cannot reverse it. We've been for 20 years trying to put the Iranian genie back in the box, and we can't. There's now much fear than ballyhooed Quds force of the Revolutionary Guard was a small unit of the Guards before Iraq happened. It was in Iraq that it became the empire that it is. And finally, I would say that regardless of what we argue about the sagacity of going into Iraq, at some point the war lost the American public. The cost of it, the outcome of it, it created a sense of aversion to war on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats. At the base of these parties, there is an aversion to war. In the region, but I'm sure, farther away in China, in Russia, the conclusion is that the United States will no longer go to war that easily. We rely on sanctions, but essentially we are far less capable of getting our way on the world stage because many friends or foes don't see credibility in our use of threat of force. And I think, American geostrategy, American world standing, particularly in the Middle East, has not recovered from the outcome of the Iraq war.
I'd like to get more into the impact in just a moment, but Charles Dulfer, I'll turn to you here about those weapons of mass destruction because they were the primary justification to launch the invasion, and you led the Iraq study group to find those weapons of mass destruction in 2005. Your final report said that the hunt for those weapons had, quote, gone as far as feasible, and all the headlines ran, no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. But I'd like to get your reaction to what Mr. Wolfowitz raised about the possibility of Saddam Hussein reconstituting those weapons. Did you find that to be true?
In a word, yes. And bear in mind, the intelligence assessments about Saddam's WMD were wrong, but they were wrong for several reasons. For one reason, there was an attitude basically that Saddam would be crazy not to have WMD. Remember, in the 1980s, he was at war with Iran. Iran was using something called human wave attacks. Saddam made and used 101,000 chemical munitions. Arguably, that saved him in that war. Secondly, in the 1991 war, when Iraq went into Kuwait, the United States expelled him from Kuwait, but did not go to Baghdad. Saddam had in his mind that one of the reasons contributing to the failure or the decision not to go to Baghdad in 1991 was his possession of WMD at that time. Add to that the experience, as Paul mentioned, of the weapons inspectors where we were in Iraq on the ground trying to account and put in place a monitoring system for what he had acknowledged. But he started off with a big lie. He only acknowledged at first the obvious things, ballistic missiles and chemical munitions. There was a pattern of gradual revelations, which, ironically, the closer he came to telling the truth, the less we really believed him because the pattern of lies was longer and more established. When the weapons inspectors left, the United States intelligence community and intelligence communities around the planet were left largely blind. From 1998, when the weapons inspectors left, up until the beginning of the war, there was very little data to make assessments on. And so the assessments tended to be negative, particularly after 9/11, when the risk of being wrong, the tolerance for risk was very low. So I think it's important to understand the background when the decision was made to go into the war in 2003. The decision, I think, and the implementation of it, you can make very strong criticisms of, as Volley has done. But the point in time when that decision was made, it's hard to imagine a different decision, in fact, being taken.
Ambassador Wolfowitz, you have said that there were mistakes made after the invasion, and that helped to contribute to the destruction we have seen and the devastation for Iraqis in the years since. What were those mistakes in your mind?
I wouldn't put it that it was a mistake to disband the Iraqi army. It was an instrument of tyranny, and it wasn't very popular. And most of the Shia draftees in that army just went home at the end of the war. The mistake was trying to replace it with a small mechanized force that was not supposed to do internal security. This is in the middle of when the only real threat in Iraq at that point was an internal one. And we formed, I think it was three very small divisions that were only supposed to guard the borders. That wasn't the problem. And there were many, many Iraqis who were lining up to re-enlist in the army. We could have created a different one, and that's what we in the Pentagon and most of the interagency thought we were going to do before we went in. We went to Iraq saying we would liberate Iraq, and instead we imposed an occupation, and some of the leading religious authorities in that country said, "What are you doing here? You said you would liberate us, and now we have an occupation." That sounds just like what the Israelis are doing on the West Bank and Gaza. It was a terrible mistake, and I think we paid a large price for that at the beginning.
Ambassador Wolfowitz,
can I just say very quickly?
Yes, please.
I really disagree strongly with the idea that we needed a brutal Saddam regime in order to provide stability in that region. It didn't stop the Iranians and Hezbollah from killing, I don't know the number of American Marines in Beirut in 1983 when Saddam was securely in power, and unfortunately when we were supporting him in his war against Iran. The consequence of that brutal Saddam was a 8-year war against Iran in which I think 300,000 Iraqis and 600,000 Iranians died, followed on by this occupation of Kuwait in which we had to mount one of the largest military forces in modern history to evict him from that small country. Iraq was not a force for stability under Saddam at all, quite the contrary.
Vali Nasser, would you like to respond to that?
Well, I would put the issues that Ambassador Wolfowitz raised a little differently. The issue is not that we needed Saddam for stability in the Middle East or we needed the brutal Iraqi army. The issue is that we didn't replace these with elements of order, something that either within Iraq or within the region would serve our broader goals. The issue is not protecting Saddam or the military. The issue is that we never had an adequate plan of what do we replace him with. I think is a larger legacy for the United States now because we're still dealing with the consequences of this part of it. Iranian power in the Arab world and still a weak Iraq that can be home to ISIS, can potentially be a source of danger again.
Ambassador Wolfowitz, in terms of where we are today, where this war resides in American history, Americans recognize one of the primary justifications to even launch that war was weapons of mass destruction that were never found. And it's been well reported since he passed that Colin Powell said the act he most regretted was the 2003 UN Security Council presentation where he laid out evidence, U.S. evidence, for those Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, which turned out not to exist. What is your response to that?
I think it was a mistake to talk about stockpiles, and I attribute that to the way the intelligence was coming through. Everyone believed that intelligence, not only our people, the French and German intelligence were pretty much saying the same thing. We should have been more careful, and I think the conclusion that Charles Delfer arrived at, which is that there was a capability to regenerate programs, would have been a much better place to stand on. And history would also be very different if we had adopted a different military strategy from the beginning. It took us, I think, the correct number of years is from 2003 to 2006 or 7 to institute the counterinsurgency strategy that General Petraeus applied successfully. If we had started that earlier, I believe history would look very different now.
Vali Nasser, I'll give you the last word here. What would you say?
It's important to think about the fact that had this war, as Ambassador Wolfowitz suggested, been conducted differently after we entered into Iraq, had we left a different legacy there, the question of the reasons we went in would not loom as large as they do right now. When we continuously debate reasons why we went in and question the motivations of going in, it's almost we are admitting to the fact that it's better we wouldn't have gone to war because if we went to war, we're going to make a mess of it. And I don't think that's a good legacy for the United States. I think how we conducted the war after we arrived is as important as the reasons why we went in.
It is striking that 20 years later, we are still debating and still discussing the impact of that war. Vali Nasser, Charles Delfer, and Paul Wolfowitz, thank you very much for joining us.